Hey everyone! Before this story unfolds, take a second to ground yourself because this is not just a rise story. This is a domination story. A reminder that when power underestimates patience, it builds its own downfall. If you believe in comeback stories where the queen doesn't beg for a seat but builds her own throne, like this story, subscribe to the channel and welcome to Black Queen Dominion. This story began the way many attempts at humiliation do, quietly, confidently, and dripping with arrogance. The kind of arrogance that assumes control before it earns it. He did not see generosity when he handed over the money. He saw entertainment. He saw proof. He saw the final nail in what he assumed would be a short-lived dream. $1,000 placed into my hands not as support but as bait. A test he was certain I would fail. The amount was intentional. It was small enough to mock, large enough to tempt, and framed as an opportunity one would supposedly waste. The unspoken expectation hung heavy in the air, that I would burn through it, stumble publicly, and confirm every quiet assumption already made about my limits. He believed failure was already written, and the money was simply the evidence he would later point to. What he did not understand was that survival sharpens vision. When a woman has been underestimated long enough, she learns to read intention before instruction. I did not see money. I saw leverage. I saw time compressed into currency. I saw a test designed to end me and I decided it would begin me instead. The business he mocked was not just a concept. It was an industry he felt entitled to. One he believed belonged to people like him, built by people like him, controlled by people who never had to prove they belonged. He spoke of it with dismissal as though the entire structure was untouchable by someone like me. That dismissal was the spark. I studied while others doubted. I listened while others laughed. I watched patterns, inefficiencies, power gaps, and ego-driven mistakes. I did not rush. I did not announce. I did not perform resilience for applause. I built quietly because queens do not rehearse dominance out loud. The $1,000 became inventory, research, access, and credibility stacked carefully, not emotionally. Every cent was placed with intention. There was no chaos, no waste, no desperation. The goal was not survival. The goal was control. He checked in occasionally, not to guide but to confirm delay. He expected updates that sounded uncertain. He expected hesitation. He expected excuses. What he received instead was silence. Silence unsettles people who expect noise from failure. Weeks passed. Then months. The business began moving, not loudly but effectively. Customers appeared. Systems formed. Cash flow stabilized. What began as a mocked idea became something operational. Something measurable. Something alive. He still did not see it. That was the advantage. Because power rarely looks down twice. And while he remained confident in his narrative, I was dismantling it piece by piece. I reinvested. I scaled cautiously. I learned where the business bled money and where it printed it. I understood that ownership was not about titles, but about who controlled decisions when pressure arrived. By the time he noticed movement, it was already too late to dismiss it as luck. The irony was brutal. The very business he believed I was unfit to run was revealing his blind spots. His operation was bloated, ego-driven, and fragile beneath its polished exterior. Mine was lean, adaptive, and hungry. While he relied on reputation, I relied on results. The $1,000 had multiplied not just financially but strategically. It had purchased insight. It had purchased patience. It had purchased a seat at a table he never expected me to approach, let alone reshape. This was no longer about proving him wrong. That phase had expired. This was about ownership. As the chapter closed, the foundation was set. The mockery had faded into background noise. The systems were aligned. The path forward was clear. What he thought was a lesson was becoming a takeover. And the next phase would require something far more dangerous than money. It would require him to underestimate me one last time. Power does not panic when challenged. It panics when replaced quietly. By the time the business was stable, I understood something critical. Success alone would not be enough. Growth without positioning is still vulnerability. The goal was no longer to build something adjacent to him. The goal was to become unavoidable within his own space. He still believed he was watching a slow experiment. He still believed time was on his side. That belief was expensive. While he maintained the image of control, cracks formed beneath his operation. Staff turnover increased. Customer loyalty weakened. Decision-making slowed under the weight of ego. He was managing perception instead of performance. I was managing outcomes. The $1,000 that once symbolized mockery now symbolized precision. Every move I made reduced his margin of error. I studied acquisition paths. I learned supplier leverage. I mapped dependency chains. The business landscape revealed itself not as a battlefield, but as a chessboard where most players only knew how to move forward. I did not compete loudly. I did not undercut recklessly. I positioned my business as the quieter, smarter alternative. Reliability replaced flash. Efficiency replaced image. Customers noticed. Partners noticed. Investors began to watch. The shift was subtle but devastating. His brand depended on being the obvious choice. Once that certainty dissolved, everything else followed. Questions replaced assumptions. Hesitation replaced loyalty. And hesitation is where power bleeds. I reinvested profits into infrastructure, not vanity. Systems replaced personalities. Processes replaced improvisation. Where his business relied on him being present, mine thrived without me. That difference would become fatal. The moment I realized the possibility of acquisition, I did not rush it. Ownership is not taken, it is prepared for. I waited for the moment when his confidence would force him into a mistake. That moment arrived disguised as expansion. He stretched too far. Took on debt to maintain dominance. Overestimated brand strength. Underestimated market fatigue. The same arrogance that handed me the $1,000 now inflated his risk tolerance. I positioned capital. Built relationships. Secured quiet backing. Not because I needed saving, but because leverage multiplies impact. When the opportunity appeared, it looked accidental. An opening. A vulnerability. A deal framed as temporary relief. He never imagined who was standing on the other side of the transaction. The paperwork moved faster than his awareness. Control shifted in layers, not headlines. Partial stake. Advisory influence. Operational oversight. Step legal. Each step irreversible. By the time he recognized the gravity, the balance of power had already tipped. This was not revenge driven by anger. It was dominance driven by clarity. The business he mocked was no longer separate from his own. It was intertwined. Dependent. Slowly absorbing the functions he once believed defined him. I did not erase his name. I made it irrelevant. The $1,000 had completed its transformation. It was no longer currency. It was the seed of a takeover. As this chapter closed, the final stage approached. Ownership was within reach. Control was imminent. And the man who believed he had funded a failure was about to witness the cost of underestimating a queen who builds in silence. In the world of business, control is never loud until it's absolute. Most people believe dominance is demonstrated by public displays, by the meetings they attend, by the titles they carry. But true power, true dominance, lives in the silence of preparation, in the patience of precision, and in the unseen threads that weave influence long before anyone realizes it. By the time he noticed, I had already written the rules of engagement, even if he still held the paperwork in his hand. The $1,000 had done more than fund a fledgling business. It had bought me time to understand the weaknesses he would never admit. Every operational flaw, every dependency, every moment of overconfidence became a lever. I did not move recklessly. I moved intentionally. Step by step, I prepared to turn what he believed was a temporary distraction into the foundation of my unchallengeable presence. When the opportunity to formalize control appeared, it came disguised as a favor. He believed he was merely extending goodwill, providing guidance, maintaining his status as the experienced player who had handed me a lesson. But the irony was exquisite. The documents he signed, the clauses he overlooked, the temporary agreements he considered trivial, all were engineered to transfer influence incrementally and invisibly into my hands. He never read them in full. He assumed trust would suffice. Arrogance whispered in his ear louder than caution. The man who thought he had taught me how to fail had, in reality, trained himself to sign away authority without knowing it. Every initial, every dotted line, every cursory glance contributed to the silent dismantling of his empire's independence. I did not rush. I did not pressure. I waited for his confidence to collapse under its own weight. And it did. I built alliances behind the scenes. Stakeholders, suppliers, and clients, those who understood reliability, efficiency, and vision, began to see me as the stable axis around which operations rotated. Where his leadership was performative, mine was substantive. When opportunities arose to integrate my services with his, I did so subtly, never announcing my presence but embedding influence. His brand and mine began overlapping not because of competition but because I had positioned my business as indispensable. The signed documents solidified what words could not. Advisory boards, joint projects, licensing agreements, each carefully crafted to appear temporary, to appear benign, yet each one quietly cemented control. I did not need headlines or drama. By the time he realized the scope of the change, the power had shifted. The leverage that once belonged to him was now a tool in my hands. And the beauty of it was that he was still under the illusion that he was observing the experiment. He did not see that the experiment had already concluded. The lesson he thought he was teaching me, the one he thought would result in my failure, was now being internalized as his own defeat. The irony was profound, almost poetic. A queen built her empire not by destroying him openly, but by rendering his authority irrelevant, while he remained blind to the inevitability of the outcome. By the time our operations merged, my business had already absorbed the critical functions of his. Key accounts, distribution channels, partnerships, all were now under my oversight. He maintained the appearance of control, believing that presence equaled power. I allowed it because the illusion worked to my advantage. As long as he thought he remained influential, he continued to make mistakes, overextend, and underestimate the quiet force gradually enveloping his empire. The $1,000 was no longer a loan, a test, or a joke. It was the seed of inevitability. Every dollar, every decision, every strategic maneuver had created momentum he could not counteract. The power balance had shifted entirely before he even comprehended it. When he attempted to intervene, his influence was already diminished. Every argument, every objection was filtered through systems, processes, and alliances I had already established. His words no longer carried weight. His presence was optional, but my influence was indispensable. And still he never suspected that the very business he had mocked, the one he thought would crumble under my hands, was now a mechanism for complete control. I did not gloat. I did not announce victories prematurely. Queens do not need applause to command attention. Silence, patience, and precision spoke louder than any confrontation. By controlling the flow of operations, by embedding myself within the essential structures, I became the axis of decision-making without appearing to replace him outright. The beauty of strategic dominance is that it makes the opposition complicit in their own downfall. Every action he took, every decision made under false confidence, further entrenched my authority. He became a participant in a narrative he did not understand, reinforcing my influence while assuming he was maintaining his own. The $1,000, a symbol of his scorn, had purchased this inevitability. It was during this phase that I realized how underestimated women often succeed in ways that men never anticipate. When society or an individual places limits on a queen, assuming she will fail without recognition or support, she learns to operate invisibly, to move within shadows, to let patience multiply power. Every oversight, every dismissive glance, every laugh at my ambition became another stepping stone. By the time his empire would have needed him to intervene meaningfully, my systems had already absorbed that necessity. I watched silently as his confidence waned, not because he recognized me as a rival, but because the outcomes were shifting beneath him. Partners and clients began seeking my insight before his. His operations relied on decisions that I now influenced. By the time he realized the magnitude, the control was undeniable. I did not need confrontation to prove authority. Authority proved itself through operational reality, through influence, through outcomes. And so the deal was done, though he thought it was casual, temporary, inconsequential. The $1,000 had evolved into infrastructure, networks, influence, and inevitability. The man who handed me money to fail had unknowingly financed the very mechanism of his own diminished control. The stage is set for the ultimate shift. The trap is no longer conceptual. It is operational. It is undeniable. The moment of revelation, when the mocker recognizes the force he empowered, is approaching. And when it arrives, it will be a lesson in dominance, patience, and the quiet inevitability of a queen who builds without noise, who plans without ego, and who turns scorn into sovereignty. Power is rarely taken in a single moment. It is accumulated in layers, woven through patience, influence, and the subtle dismantling of assumptions. By the time the shift became visible, it was already inevitable. What he believed he controlled was only a shadow of its former self, a shell of authority that no longer dictated outcomes. And yet he persisted, believing that appearance could replace reality. The transition from influence to dominance was gradual, surgical, and unrelenting. Every decision he made now intersected with systems I had installed, processes I had optimized, and alliances I had carefully nurtured. His reach, once unquestioned, was now filtered through my mechanisms. What he thought was negotiation, contingency planning, or operational oversight was, in reality, compliance with my design. The empire he assumed was his own now operated under a quiet authority he could neither contest nor fully perceive. Every staff member, supplier, and client became a vector of influence. I had cultivated relationships built not on intimidation, but on trust, reliability, and consistency, qualities he had neglected in favor of appearance. Where his operation relied on personality and ego, mine relied on systems and precision. By the time he realized the power dynamic had shifted, he was already operating under my terms, constrained not by law or contracts alone, but by necessity. The first unmistakable signs came when his decisions were routinely overridden by circumstances he no longer controlled. A critical partnership he assumed he could leverage for advantage was already aligned with me. A supplier he trusted implicitly had quietly shifted priorities to favor the business he had mocked. His influence had eroded so thoroughly that even minor operational decisions required my tacit approval to succeed. The $1,000 he had handed me to fail had multiplied far beyond its financial value. It had transformed into an infrastructure of inevitability. He began to notice, slowly, uneasily, as though the pieces of the world he thought he commanded were no longer following his design. And yet he still misunderstood the scale of what had been achieved. Confidence had blinded him to strategic subtlety. He believed he could intervene, reclaim control, or reverse the course. But the truth is, once influence is embedded, reversal becomes impossible without dismantling the entire structure. And that is something no individual can do alone. I did not confront him directly. Queens do not announce dominance, they demonstrate it. Every operational success, every seamless transition, every client who relied on my guidance instead of his was a reminder that authority had shifted. Publicly, he retained titles and presence, but functionally he was secondary. The business he once scorned was no longer merely surviving. It was thriving, expanding, and absorbing opportunities that he could not access without my cooperation. The psychological impact of this shift was as significant as the practical one. He began second-guessing, overcomplicating decisions, and questioning the reliability of his own judgment. The man who had expected me to fail now found that his influence was the very mechanism through which my power consolidated. Every attempt to assert control was filtered through systems, alliances, and structures I had already orchestrated. Even resistance became an instrument of my authority. It was a quiet victory, but devastatingly absolute. No confrontation, no spectacle, no drama. Only the seamless transition of power from arrogance to precision. He had trained me unintentionally to succeed within his domain. Every dismissive glance, every underestimated effort, every laugh at my ambition became a step in my rise. By the time he understood the consequences of his underestimation, the change was complete. Operationally, I now controlled the levers of the business. Every critical decision, every strategic expansion, every key partnership flowed through channels I had aligned. His presence was ceremonial, his input consultative at best, and his authority practically obsolete. The empire he once dismissed as trivial had become the engine through which he operated, and one he could no longer direct independently. And yet, this control was not maintained through aggression. It was maintained through inevitability. Staff loyalty, client dependence, and systemic efficiency ensured that my influence was not a matter of opinion. It was a fact. Even the man who had sought to undermine me was forced to operate within the framework I had constructed. His choices were limited, constrained not by law, but by the networks, systems, and operational realities I had created. The $1,000, the seed of mockery, had matured into complete operational dominance. What began as a test of failure had become a mechanism for inevitable success. Every element of the business, Every chain of decision-making, every point of influence was aligned with my vision. The man who had sought to humiliate me was now a participant in a narrative he did not control, reinforcing my authority through his own continued engagement. As I observed this shift, I understood the broader lesson. Underestimation is dangerous. Dismissal is costly. Arrogance is fatal when it blinds the individual to the subtle accumulation of power around them. What he had assumed would be a failure was, in truth, a quiet takeover. He had given me the tools and the platform and the lessons, and I had transformed them into leverage, into infrastructure, into absolute authority. The final stages were subtle. No dramatic confrontation, no public declaration. Only the quiet recognition, first by staff, then by partners, then by clients, that leadership had shifted. The man who had once mocked the business now relied upon it for his own success, navigating a structure I had designed, constrained by the very system he had underestimated. The $1,000, once intended to prove my incompetence, had purchased a power that could not be unmade. The mechanisms are in place, the influence irreversible, and the narrative of domination complete. The business he had scorned is now my domain, operating under my strategy, vision, and authority. The man who sought to witness my failure is now a participant in my success, powerless to reclaim the power he believed was his. Victory is not loud. It is a quiet certainty that consolidates every move made in patience, precision, and purpose. By the time I stepped into the final phase, it was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about claiming what had always been within reach, the empire that had been underestimated, dismissed, and mocked. The $1,000, once intended as a tool of ridicule, had become the instrument of absolute authority. He thought he had the advantage. He thought familiarity with the industry, reputation, and prior success would protect him from the inevitability of my rise. But those are illusions easily shattered when strategy, timing, and unwavering focus align. I had moved silently, relentlessly, embedding influence and building operational dominance. He had laughed at me once, scoffed at my ambition, and assumed the outcome was pre-written. He did not realize that the outcome had always depended on how quietly a queen could rise before the world even noticed. The purchase of his business was not dramatic. There were no flashing headlines, no confrontational standoffs, no public spectacle. It was done through precision, layered agreements, leveraged partnerships, and strategic investments that had been quietly aligned months before. Every element of the acquisition had been orchestrated to appear natural, almost incidental, so that by the time he realized the scale, the shift was irreversible. The same man who believed he was funding a failure had unwittingly enabled the complete transfer of ownership into my hands. I absorbed not just the assets but the brand, the operations, and the network of influence. Every client, every partner, every key connection that had once elevated him was now aligned under my strategy. Where he relied on reputation, I relied on results. Where he depended on appearances, I depended on systems. By the time the final signature was inked, the transition had already been operationally complete. Control was not symbolic. It was functional, undeniable, and absolute. And the irony was exquisite. The business he had mocked, the one he had assumed I would fail to grow, had not only survived but thrived, expanded, and now belonged entirely to me. It was no longer just a victory. It was a reclamation, a transformation, and a demonstration of how underestimated ambition can convert scorn into sovereignty. The $1,000 had multiplied exponentially, not in wealth alone but in influence, power, and authority. He could not deny it. Every move he attempted to make, every suggestion, every input, every strategic maneuver, was now subject to structures I had implemented. His influence, once taken for granted, was reduced to consultation at best. The very empire he had laughed at had become my dominion, and every facet of it operated on my terms. I had not merely survived his skepticism, I had absorbed it, converted it, and used it as the foundation for absolute control. The transformation of that initial investment into dominance was complete. Every obstacle he had placed in my path, every sneer, every underestimation, every condescending glance, had become a stepping stone to ascendancy. The empire was no longer a separate entity from my vision. It was a direct extension of it. Every decision now reinforced my authority, every outcome validated my strategy, and every stakeholder, clients, partners, and suppliers alike, recognized the inevitability of my leadership. By the time he understood the magnitude of the shift, the opportunity for reversal had passed. The transition was clean, methodical, and unassailable. There was no public humiliation, no theatrics, no spectacle of revenge. The triumph was in the inevitability, in the quiet completion of a strategy that turned mockery into mastery. He had handed me $1,000 to fail, but in doing so he had written the very blueprint for my success. And so, the final phase was not about proving him wrong. It was about demonstrating what happens when underestimated potential meets strategic patience. The business he had laughed at now bore my name, my vision, and my authority. Where he had assumed dominance, I had installed inevitability. Where he had expected failure, I had engineered triumph. And where he had once mocked, he now witnessed an unassailable reality. The queen he underestimated had risen, expanded, and ultimately claimed what was hers. The lesson is unmistakable. Never underestimate the quiet ambition of a woman who has been doubted. Mockery is fuel, underestimation is leverage, and patience is power. The $1,000 intended as bait had become the instrument of dominance, the seed of an empire, and the evidence of what happens when scorn meets strategy. As the story concludes, the empire thrives not because of luck or circumstance, but because every move was deliberate, every system intentional, and every strategy calculated. The man who believed he was witnessing a failure had instead enabled a rise that transformed mockery into mastery, skepticism into sovereignty, and doubt into domination. The throne was no longer hypothetical. It had been built step by step, dollar by dollar, decision by decision. And it was mine. Every asset, every influence, every operational advantage, all flowed under my direction. The kingdom he once assumed belonged to him had been quietly claimed, systematically consolidated, and fully owned by the woman he believed could never succeed. In the end, the story is not merely one of revenge. It is a lesson in power, patience, and the relentless pursuit of inevitability. The $1,000 was never just money. It was a test, a spark, and ultimately the foundation of triumph. The business he mocked became the empire he could no longer control. And I, the queen who had been underestimated, rose quietly, strategically, and undeniably to claim what was always hers. The empire stands today not as a monument to fortune, but as proof of precision, patience, and the unstoppable power of a woman who builds silently, rises confidently, and transforms mockery into mastery.